Hello and grand rising. Welcome to Wake Up Investigates. I am journalist, broadcaster and all-round troublemaker Sonia Poulton. Welcome to all the good people who are joining us, whether you've joined us in the live chat or on multiple platforms, including YouTube, Rumble, X and Spotify. It's Friday, August the 1st, 2025. It's 9:01 a.m. British summertime, and this is Wake Up Investigates, the show that knows just because they call you a king, it doesn't mean you're a gentleman, which is very apt for today's show, because I want to swiftly turn my attention to today's investigation. It's important to understand, and I cannot overstate this, the current king, as he's known, of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth countries, that would be Charles Windsor, latterly known as King Charles III, has been guided, influenced, informed and advised at every stage of his life by perverts, predators and paedophiles. And you thought your upbringing was weird. You ain't seen nothing yet. This is not a dramatic statement, by the way, but a factual one. Now, in some respects, that makes Charles no different from most of the kings and queens who came before him. The royal family has been given special privileges in society by a quirk of fate, and they are as dysfunctional and warped as it comes, as I will explain over the next couple of hours or so. So settle in. The aim is not only to bring it together what I have learned as an investigative journalist who made a film called Paedophiles in Parliament, which examined decades of child abuse rumours within the British establishment, but also to question more deeply why Charles has been so close to so many child abusers his whole life and how that may have impacted him. With so many predators around him, you have to ask, why does the stench of child abuse follow the British royal family, and none more so than the current head of the firm, King Charles III? Is it a coincidence? Is it misfortune? Was he born into it? Was this a path that was already set for him? From the beginning, he has, as I say, been surrounded and influenced by child abusers. What chance, some may ask, did he have for a normal life? And I want to examine how normalised child abuse is within royal circles. So to go back, Charles III, also known as Charles Philip Arthur George, was born on the 14th of November 1948. He is King of the United Kingdom and the 14 other Commonwealth realms, including New Zealand, Australia and the Bahamas. He became king, acceded to the British throne, as they like to say, on his mother's death on the 8th of September 2022. He was the longest serving British heir apparent, having surpassed Edward VII's record of 59 years. He was also the oldest person to succeed to the British throne at the age of 73. Clearly, Queen Elizabeth did not want to hand over the reins to him. She was the queen right up to her dying day, and one should perhaps ask why. Charles's coronation and that of his queen Camilla took place at Westminster Abbey on 6th of May 2023. Plans had been made for many years under the code name Operation Golden Orb, which in itself, interesting title. The coronation was a Church of England rite through and through. It included the coronation oath, the anointing, the crowning, the investing with the regalia and the enthronement, all deeply symbolic actions. He was crowned by Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, who resigned just over a year later, forced out following his failure to act on a Church of England child abuser and a man who was possibly a murderer too, more of which later. So in order to better understand the influences circulating around Charles, I want to go back to the beginning, because I know how influential our formative years are in shaping us. By most accounts, Charles was a sensitive child with two emotionally distant parents. He frequently sought out substitute parents, which may explain why so many predators were around him. They likely spotted his vulnerabilities due to his needs not being met by his parents. His formal education began at the age of 5 when Catherine Peebles was appointed governess to oversee his education at Buckingham Palace. And there it took a slightly different turn to what had come before. He then commenced classes at Hill House School in West London. Let me see if I can get a bigger image of this up, actually. Let me just try, because I think this is important too. Let me just bring that. There you go. These are some images of him throughout his school days. So he commenced classes at Hill House School in West London in November 1956. And what was interesting was Charles was the first heir apparent to attend school rather than be educated by a private tutor at Buckingham Palace. From there, Charles subsequently attended two of his father's former schools, Cheam School in Hampshire from 1958, followed by Gordonston in Scotland from April 1962. He later became patron of Gordonston in May 2024. The top picture, there he is, little boy, and that's his first day at Cheam School. The middle picture is him shaking hands with the housemaster at Gordonston. And the bottom is when he went to university. And what was interesting about Charles later becoming a patron at Gordonston as recently as May 2024 is because some would say that was an unusually long period of time since he was associated with the place. And also because it has become known latterly for abuse that was rife there. But still, Charles, like on other occasions, as we will discuss, ploughed ahead with his association, regardless of what it may say about him. In fact, other than Hill House, the prep school, it should be noted that every single educational establishment that Charles attended has since been hit with claims of child abuse. Predatory paedophiles are part of the history of many celebrated schools in Britain. It's become predictably and depressingly familiar these days to realise how unsafe so many of these children were and are. Charles did not want to go to Gordonston, and he once described it as Colditz in kilts. But his father, then Prince Philip of Greece, latterly the Duke of Edinburgh, had gone there and insisted that he also went there. After Charles, other royals followed. 5 of the Queen's children and grandchildren went there, despite Charles' complaints about the place. By the 1970s, Gordonston was being touted as a place for wealthy children who needed toughening up. And examples, Sean Connery and David Bowie both sent their sons there. Physical punishment, strict discipline, and cold showers were routine. The school was notorious not just for being tough, but for bullying and for child sexual abuse. And as I say, at every one of Charles's educational establishments, there has been an abuse scandal and a cover-up, bar the prep school that we so far know about. And what's to say that Charles didn't also experience abuse at some stage, or at least that he was aware of it, and it has informed who he is. There is so much abuse in private schools, boarding schools, day schools, colleges, universities, ritualistic abuse. Many of our world issues are decided and informed by men who are educated in these environments that involved punishing and ritualistic initiations. Charles was, for sure. As part of his initiation at Gordonston, age 13, he is said to have been caged naked in a basket and left under a cold shower. Very bizarre behaviour. You didn't get that in the local secondary modern where I went to. And after Gordonston, Charles went to Trinity College in Cambridge in October 1967, where he studied archaeology and anthropology at first and then switched to history for the second part. During his second year, he attended the University College of Wales in Aberystwyth. He studied Welsh history and the Welsh language for one term. Again, this set him apart. He was to be the Prince of Wales, and he was the first heir apparent and Prince of Wales who actually took some time to learn the native language. And he became also the first British heir apparent to earn a university degree, graduating in June 1970 from the University of Cambridge with a 2:2 Bachelor of Arts. In August 1975, and no, it wasn't a very good Bachelor of Arts degree, but in August 1975, it was promoted to a Master of Arts degree. Just like that. Because, well, he's royal, innit? And it is more than a two-tier society, as we all know. And yes, Trinity College, like everywhere else Charles has attended, has also had its fair share of abuse scandals. So, did Charles's childhood and education further normalise what was already normal in his somewhat dysfunctional family? Gordonston, by the way, was one of 6 private schools investigated at the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry in 2020 under the gaze of Lady Smith, chair of the inquiry. The other schools in Scotland to be scrutinised included Fettes College in Edinburgh, where former PM Tony Blair went to, and the Queen Victoria School in Dunblane. Now, I've covered this school before in relation to the Dunblane atrocity, where Thomas Hamilton murdered school children at Dunblane Primary School. And Queen Victoria School in Dunblane, let's see, I've got an image of it to show you. Yes, Queen Victoria School in Dunblane was constituted by a royal warrant initiated by Queen Victoria, enacted by her son, King Edward VII, who signed it in 1905. The school was established with the initial aim of providing support and education to sons of Scottish servicemen of ranks other than officers. Prince Philip was the patron at Queen Victoria School in Dunblane, and Prince Andrew also visited the school. The inquiry found that the children at the military boarding school were subjected to dreadful and horrific abuse. Lady Smith said the pupils at Queen Victoria School were all boarders and they were exposed to risks of sexual, physical and emotional abuse. For many of them, these risks materialised and children suffered alone. I have no difficulty in finding that children were abused by staff whose abusive practices were such that they must, or at least ought to, excuse me, let me just clean my nose a second. Excuse me. That's what happens when you're live on air, right? Just do a double check, make sure everything's nice and dandy, fine. And Lady Smith said, I have no difficulty in finding that children were abused by staff whose abusive practices were such that they must, or at least ought to, have been obvious to those in positions of responsibility. Further, they were abused by senior and other pupils, some of whose practices must or ought to have been obvious, which brings me back to my point, and that is, and Charles didn't go to Queen Victoria School, but obviously his father was a patron, his brother was a visitor, and so it was sort of by royal appointment, obviously, Queen Victoria School and all that. And it brings me back to my point that a lot of the abuse that was also taking place in these places, in these private educational facilities, was also pupil on pupil, because the pupils were picking it up from the adults around them, and it was that sort of environment where it was permitted to abuse each other, and that was taking place at Queen Victoria's School. And Lady Smith also noted about Queen Victoria's School that throughout many decades, particularly in the late 1950s to the early 1990s, the assumption that there was abuse was ill-founded. In fact, children for whose care the school was responsible were abused. Lady Smith said that 2 teachers in particular had sexually abused pupils in different decades. Ben Phillip, a teacher at QVS between 1973 and 1993, 20 years How much abuse did that man carry out? But he was said to have groomed and abused multiple boys. And there was James Clark, a drumming instructor, was jailed for 1 year and 9 months in 2021 for abusing 7 female pupils between 2011 and 2019, including by means of indecent assaults. He groomed them openly, said Lady Smith, so as to seek to normalise sexual behaviour. And this is my point, is that as we've already started to see, Charles, practically from birth, was already initiated into environments where abuse was rife and normalised. But the fact is, the Scottish child abuse inquiry was only the tip of a staggering iceberg. It almost systematically failed to nail down what was the real issue at Queen Victoria School. And part of that real issue, of course, involved Thomas Hamilton. Thomas Hamilton, in this picture, was the gunman who killed small children at a primary school in Dunblane in Scotland. And he was a regular visitor at Queen Victoria School. And he was involved almost certainly in procuring the boys for members of the Scottish and English establishment. The first reports of child abuse came from Glenn Harrison, a former housemaster at Queen Victoria School, who initially warned parents that their children could be in danger and were at risk. And despite all this, there was a problem with Police Scotland. And Mr. Harrison was actually informed that the problem with his complaints was that the school was covered by the Official Secrets Act, and as a result, they could not further his investigations. He was also mistreated. He was harassed as a result of his claim, with police responding to his complaint by breaking down the door to his flat and escorting him from the school premises to be interviewed by detectives. It was Glenn Harrison, by the way, who famously refused to sit next to Prince Andrew at a Queen Victoria School event as a protest. He said that the amount of distress put on pupils led to him and his wife refusing to sit next to Prince Andrew at an event in protest at the many unheard voices and suffering of young boys, because it initially had been young boys who were abused. And there were other agencies implicated and involved who did absolutely nothing, including the NSPCC, whose job is to safeguard children. And they said that they found evidence of bullying, but said other allegations had been exaggerated by Mr. Harrison, and that they would not be following up his claims of historic sexual abuse. I've done a separate report into the NSPCC, which has long been a gatekeeping operation and has systematically failed children as recently up to present time. It is not there to protect children, not at all. I would go so far as to say that the NSPCC arguably is there to protect abusers of children involved within the British establishment. And it was Mr. Harrison was concerned about Thomas Hamilton, but nobody took him seriously. And that's one example of some of the educational environments that surrounded Charles and his family that were rife with child sexual abuse. But child abuse connected to royals and members of the establishment was not restricted to Scotland, England or Wales. Far from it. There was King Cora in Ireland, a home for troubled boys, which was also a hotbed for child abuse. And it was revealed that at least, and when we say at least, it's because there is almost certainly many more. Not everybody who has been abused wants to come forward. And so it's absolutely at least. So it was revealed that at least 39 boys were assaulted at King Cora, which eventually led to the imprisonment of 3 men for the abuse of 11 boys. These men were William McGrath, Joseph Mains and Raymond Semple. They were said to be abusing and supplying the boys. But to whom? Whom might they be abusing and supplying these boys to? Well, this is where child abuse comes out of the educational establishments and into Charles's own family directly. There are more links to child abuse, and this is under the influence of Uncle Dickie, also known as Lord Mountbatten. Let's see what imagery we have for Uncle Dickie. I'm sure I can find something here, just bear with me. And Uncle Dickie, I'm sure many of you know him. He was also known, his long title, which I'm going to read in 2 seconds. Let's just find a picture of him so we all know who we're talking about here. But a man who had extraordinary privilege in his life. Here is an image with Uncle Dickie, of Uncle Dickie rather, with author Andrew Loney. Now, I've interviewed Andrew Loney a number of times. I know Andrew very, very well. Andrew wrote this book. It's a brilliant book, The Lives and Loves of the Mountbattens, and it actually details forensically the perversions of the Mountbattens. That was Dickie and his wife Edwina. Now, Lord Mountbatten was known, his official title was Admiral of the Fleet Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten, 1st Earl Mountbatten of Burma, commonly referred to as Lord Mountbatten. He was a British statesman, Royal Navy officer, and close relative of the British royal family. He was born at Frogmore House in Windsor, 1900, and over a decade later, it would become the English home for Harry and Meghan before they sodded off to the US. Lord Mountbatten was assassinated on the 27th of August, 1979. You just bring in some imagery. I'm sure some of our viewers will remember this. I remember it. I remember it clearly. I had no clue about what was going on at the time, and it just appeared absolutely horrendous to me. He was, as they say, murdered by the IRA. He was assassinated 27th August 1979 at Mullamore Island, near to his home, when a bomb planted on his fishing boat by the IRA exploded, killing him and his grandson Nicholas, as well as young crew member Paul. Also, his daughter's mother-in-law, Lady Brabourne, died of her injuries the next day. And the thing about Lord Louis Mountbatten is he stands as the absolute perfect testament to the incestuous nature of the British royal family. As with many members of the royal family, Louis Mountbatten was related to both of Charles's parents, Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth, separately. Separately, he was related to them. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria. He was a distant cousin of the Queen's, as well as being Prince Philip's uncle. Philip's mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, was Louis's sister. And Philip had somewhat adopted the surname of Mountbatten from his mother's family in 1947. And Philip had also lived with the Mountbattens for several years following his mother's institutionalization. And much of that is actually covered in the Netflix drama series, The Crown, and which obviously beautifully produced. How true it is open to question, but I would suggest rather a lot of it is, including how the royal family frequently hid members of their family, excuse me, who they considered undesirable. And that included Prince Philip's own mother. Let me have a glug of this. Now, in part, what prompted me to do this investigation was a recently released book that claims that Lord Mountbatten abused children at his Mullamore estate. And it propositions that Mountbatten was involved in a paedophile ring, which was trafficking children from Kincora Boys' Home. And the book Kincora, Britain's Shame is by Belfast-based investigative journalist Chris Moore. It delves into establishment paedophile predators, and it links them all up to loyalist paramilitary groups and also to the secret services, MI5, MI6, and the British royal family, as well as politicians. And the book alleges that Mountbatten was involved in sexual abuse of children. Three of his alleged victims have spoken to Mr. Moore about their experiences, alleged to have been carried out by Mountbatten at his former residence at Classiebawn in County Sligo. And two of the child victims were resident at King Cora's boys' home in East Belfast. The claims were previously dismissed by a historical institutional abuse inquiry between 2014 and 2016. Of course they were. I've said this before, that wherever the child abuse inquiry is in the four nations of the UK, there may have been rather some honourable people involved and wishing to get to the bottom of child abuse within the British establishment, but there has been a big fat systematic failure to do so. One of the reasons that I thought it was time to do this is because a lot of the information I'm discussing is not in hiding, it's in plain sight, it's out there. Many of the viewers of this will know about it, but this is our king. And what I'm talking about today is the very significant influences that have worked on the king and don't seem to be an issue. We all know how our formative years shape us. Well, I, as someone who has investigated establishment child abuse for well over a decade now, I believe that it is of some significance that the man who is king, not my king, but some people's king, but the man who is recognised as king has been influenced by so many predators, including the man who was something of a surrogate grandfather stroke father to him, which was Louis Mountbatten. Louis Mountbatten was extraordinarily close to Charles. Let me bring in some imagery of them together. They were very, very close. And again, because Charles was lacking loving parents, that's the reality. He was lacking loving parents. They were there to do a job, and they treated everything like a job. And where have I've got to have an image of, let me just find one. The thing I think that was interesting oftentimes about Louis Mountbatten is he led the ultimate privileged lifestyle. Here he is. Here's a good image of them together. Let me just bring that in. Yes, he led the ultimate privileged lifestyle. And of course, the thing about Lord Mountbatten was that, like all the members of the royal family, he was above and beyond reproach. There they are together, wearing medals that almost certainly they didn't earn. Although Louis was recognised as a go-getter out there in the Navy on behalf of Britain, but as we know, many times these people are completely overdressed with their regalia, and it's all part of the pomp and ceremony, as opposed to regular soldiers who generally tend to earn their stripes. But just to talk about their close relationship, Charles at times considered him an honorary grandfather, and Charles was great nephew to him, but Louis also acted in a fatherly role to him, and Mountbatten had a rather huge influence over the whole royal family, and none more so than Charles. And in 2015, Charles visited the site of Mountbatten's death, and he referenced the closeness of their relationship in his speech, saying, "I could not imagine how we would come to terms with the anguish of such a deep loss, since for me, Lord Mountbatten represented the grandfather I never had." Well, indeed, interesting. And as Andrew Loney discovered in his in-depth research, the FBI held files on Lord Mountbatten, and both Lord Mountbatten and his wife were considered persons of extremely low morals. Lord Mountbatten, it was discovered, had something of a penchant for young males. And Mountbatten was also pivotal in the role of bringing Charles's parents together in the first place, and he planned to do the same with Charles. He wanted, going back to what I say about the incestuous nature of the royal family, he wanted to keep royalty in the family, and he wanted his 16-year-old granddaughter to marry 25-year-old Charles. And Lord Mountbatten had said to Charles, and I'm quoting directly, that he should sow his wild oats and have as many affairs as he can before settling down. But he also said for a wife, he should choose a suitable, attractive and sweet-charactered girl before she has met anyone else she might fall for. It is disturbing for women to have experiences if they have to remain on a pedestal after marriage. And so that was in part obviously why they went for Diana. Diana was famously a virgin when Charles married her. It's all very nasty, isn't it? All very nasty stuff. But early in 1974, Mountbatten began corresponding with, as I say, then 25-year-old Charles about a potential marriage with Mountbatten's 16-year-old granddaughter, Amanda Knatchbull. And Charles wrote to Amanda's mother, Lady Brabourne, who was also his godmother, talk about incestuous, and he expressed his interest in her daughter. I mean, these are arranged marriages for the most part, aren't they? And Lady Brabourne replied she was approving of the union, but she suggested that a courtship with a 16-year-old might be a bit premature. You think? You think? A 16-year-old and a 25-year-old? You think? 4 years later, Mountbatten arranged for Amanda and himself to accompany Charles on Charles's planned 1980 visit to India. Both fathers, however, objected. But before that would happen, Mountbatten was assassinated in 1979 by the IRA. And when Charles returned from his trip to India, he proposed to Amanda. I expect the devastation of losing his father/grandfather figure would have been immense, regardless of how perverse he may or may not have known his substitute father to be. So Charles proposed to Amanda, but in addition to having lost her own grandfather and her grandmother and younger brother in the assassination, she was now, as you might understand, reluctant to join the royal family, and she turned him down. And it was here that Charles and Diana started to become closer, because Diana had previously met Charles when he was dating her older sister, but Diana then bumped into Charles, and Diana, being somebody who was very much in touch with her emotions, she became something of a shoulder for Charles to cry on following Mountbatten's death, and that was how they became close. That was kind of it. That was what happened. And I think it's also interesting that despite what has been said about Lord Louis Mountbatten, the legacy has somewhat continued, because it's interesting. Let me just find this image. It's interesting, I think, that William, Charles's son, named his own child Louis after Lord Louis Mountbatten. I think that's curious. And as I say, Andrew Lonely had already previously revealed that Lord Mountbatten had a lust for young men, and these were revealed from FBI files. So it was interesting. So really the question about Lord Mountbatten, was he? A number of people, not just alleged survivors, but those around him, say yes. So was Charles' mentor, grandfather figure, father figure, a child abuser? It is highly likely that yes, he was. Highly likely. There is substantial information, and the new book catalogues this, forensically so. And many of the survivors were very reluctant to come forward, as you can imagine. It's terrifying. Not only are you already vulnerable, the Kincora boys were already vulnerable. They came from dysfunctional families, and they were easy prey to predators, and it is almost certain that they were being supplied by to this international paedophile ring, which was linked to the Secret Services, the royal family, British Parliament, and Lord Louis Mountbatten. And an excellent source for what happened at Kincora is the publication The Village in Ireland. Now, you may or may not be familiar with it, but they really step outside the gate when it comes to their investigations. And they have passionately covered the corruption and cover-ups of Brits and others surrounding Lord Louis Mountbatten and some of the boys that went to Kincora, including, for example, Richard Kerr. And The Village is, I think, particularly, I think it's potent. I think it's a potent online publication. It has long lamented the failures of the various child abuse inquiries. It talked about how it displayed no interest whatsoever in Lord Louis Mountbatten's links to the Anglo-Irish vice ring. And it talks about how its members preyed upon Kincora Boys Home and other childcare institutions in Northern Ireland. And the child abuse inquiry also ignored absolutely mountains of evidence relating to the abuse of boys by British VIPs, including senior figures at Westminster, which was allegedly Enoch Powell, Sir Knox Cunningham, and more. And the thing is, Mountbatten and his ilk were born into extraordinary privilege. They wanted for nothing. They were treated with exceptional advantage wherever they went. What we work towards is handed to them. People born in such wealth and privilege do not have the same goals or indeed the same morals as the rest of us, because they have everything immediately. They work for nothing, including the roof over their heads, the food they eat. They're waited on hand and foot. They are taught from birth that they are above the rest of us. And that includes treating people who may come within their territory as something that they own and that they can abuse. And it may explain this privilege, it may explain in part why these people desire such repugnant forbidden fruits. That which is not only repugnant to decent people, but is criminal. It's a fact. And there is a great deal of evidence to back this up, that the great Lord Louis Mountbatten not only had a life of extraordinary privilege, but a life of extraordinary perversion. He was, according to Andrew Loney, and I have no reason to doubt Andrew's work is exemplary. Lord Louis Mountbatten was utterly immoral. He was a degenerate. I find it almost impossible to believe that the royal family and the men and women around them holding up the monarchy and the institution had no clue about how degenerate he and his wife was. And for me, one of the questions is, was he assassinated for being a child predator and because he symbolised everything that was wrong with the Troubles and what the IRA sought to oppose? And of course, poor victims on the boat, including children. The whole thing makes me shudder. And I think Lord Louis Mountbatten is one of those figures in British history where the establishment absolutely refused to look at him in any detail. As I say, as I referred to The Crown earlier, beautifully made, wonderful production, but do they touch upon these issues? No, absolutely not. And when The Crown was made, and certainly the part about his assassination, it was already made aware that Mountbatten was being sued in court under allegations of child abuse by one of the young men from Kincora, John Smythe. So the Crown were aware, but the Crown is a Netflix production. And so obviously it seeks to create a really beautiful, almost romanticized narrative about British monarchy. And that includes Lord Louis Mountbatten, who I'm in no doubt whatsoever was not only a pervert, but a child predator. So that brings me perhaps to one of the most famous predators whom Charles had in his inner circle for over 20 years, he being Jimmy Savile, child procurer for the British establishment, necrophiliac, abuser of hundreds of people from 8 to 80. Jimmy Savile was so much more than a DJ from the north of England who did some good. He became known for his charitable work and was said to have raised in excess of £40 million, which was huge back in the 80s and 90s, as it still is now. So you can imagine how important he was viewed and how protected. And Jimmy Savile laid down much of the foundation that Charles has built upon in his path to become king. Savile needs no introduction around here, but he was integral to Charles, and he drew up guidance for the royal family on dealing with tricky situations, which was treated by his nibs and the family, as Savile affectionately called them, as a guide for life. That Charles and the royal family all sought guidance and advice from Savile should tell everyone that he was so much more than a BBC DJ and the host of Jim Will Fix It. Savile was said to have been brought into the royal fold by none other than Louis Mountbatten in 1966. Some say it was Savile and Charles's mutual love of charitable work that brought them together. Ha, bloody ha. What did Savile and Mountbatten have in common, one might wonder? Well, for starters, it would appear that they were both predators who used their connections and establishment prestige to get away with it and to remain untouchable. And what we know is Savile committed at least 214 sex crimes. And police say, as I said, that some of his victims were as young as 8. And there was a catalogue of more than 50 years of indecent assaults, including rape. And he used his celebrity status to gain access to vulnerable children in hospitals and other places. Now, here's where it gets interesting, is obviously all of this came out about Savile properly after his death in 2012. And even though it had been known forever, apparently, and green rooms had discussed it, even Esther Ranson had said that it was a topic of green room discussion. I mean, many people have now said, I reported it to the police, they did nothing. We know that there were 50 years of reports that absolutely nothing was done about. And defenders and royalists like to tell us this. They say, how could the royals possibly have known what Jimmy Savile was like? This is naivety at its absolute best. Well, for starters, the royal family was surrounded and are surrounded by Secret Service agents whose very job it is to investigate those who seek to get close to the royal family. Savile was indeed at the royal household. Why? And why was his advice repeatedly sought? And what we've seen since is there were, for example, notes from the Prince of Wales to Savile to show that over the course of about 20 years, Savile quite literally became an unofficial advisor to Charles and the Crown. And some of this is covered in a Netflix documentary, Jimmy Savile, A British Horror Story. And that documentary revealed that Savile had produced a PR handbook for royals and their staff. Some of that advice was then incorporated in a note that was prepared for the Queen. What? See, what had happened was Prince Andrew, let's discuss him briefly before we go on to a bit more later, but Prince Andrew, around about this time, had put his proverbial foot in it. You all know how arrogant and stupid he is. He'd made insensitive comments about the Lockerbie bombing during a visit to the site in 1988. And that event had reignited a discussion about how out of touch the royal family were and how they should respond to disasters. And it was down to Jimmy Savile to write the dossier, and quite an in-depth document of advice on how the Queen should behave and how members of the royal family should behave in disaster situations and should not be in competition with each other. And in a handwritten note to Savile, Charles later wrote, I attach a copy of my memo on disasters, which incorporates your points and which I showed to my father. He showed it to the Queen. And the response was said to be quite lukewarm. But the thing was, they had this kind of like to and fro, going backwards and forwards. Savile visited Charles regularly, including at Charles's offices, and Charles visited Savile at his house in Glencoe, Scotland. But Charles often considered Savile as this kind of like, person of great wisdom. In fact, he described him as the bloke who knows what's going on, which is, I think, quite a telling description. What was it that Charles knew that Savile knew what was going on? And in another note, in 1989 rather, he wrote, "I wonder," this was to Savile, "I wonder if you would ever be prepared to meet my sister-in-law, the Duchess of York," that was, of course, Sarah Ferguson. "Can't help feeling that it would be extremely useful to her if you could. I feel she could do with some of your straightforward common sense." Sarah Ferguson, of course, married to Andrew, still lives off the royal pound, still lives with Andrew, even though they long divorced. Sarah Ferguson was said to have brought a great deal of shame to the royal family, including being caught by paparazzi, having her toe sucked by an American financier, John Bryant. Sarah Ferguson has never failed to opportunistically use the royal family connections to make money, and she was considered a bit of a liability to the royal family, which was odd in some respects, because her actions were more the actions of a young woman rather than a through and through predator, which is what Charles already had knowledge about. He had some knowledge of predators around him. He did. And Charles also told Savile in a letter that Savile was so good at understanding what makes people operate, and you're wonderfully skeptical and practical. I mean, talk about bad judgment. I absolutely find it impossible to believe that Charles was not aware of at least some of the rumours around Jimmy Savile. The Secret Services, the the Windsor household would not have allowed him not to have known. It's impossible. And the thing is, there were concerns about Savile's behaviour. They've admitted that now. Dickie Arbiter, as one example, he's a former senior aide. He revealed that Jimmy Savile's behaviour when he visited Prince Charles' official home at St James Palace was a cause for concern and suspicion. And Dickie Arbiter handled media relations for the Prince and Princess of Wales. He was also spokesman for the Queen between 1988 and 2000. He said that that Savile would come in and he used to rub his lips up the arms of Prince Charles's young female assistants as a greeting. Now, I don't care what year it is. He should not have got away with it. And I don't care how in with the royal family. He should not have got away with it. This should have been stopped. This should have been exposed. Arbiter said that Savile would walk into the office, do the rounds of the young ladies, taking their hands and rubbing his lips all the way up their arms if they were wearing short sleeves. It just feels horrible. I mean, he was such a creepy man. And Arbiter said if it was summer and their arms were bare, his bottom lip would curl out and he would run it up their arms. This was at St James's Palace. The women were in their mid to late 20s. They were doing typing and secretarial work. The thing about Jimmy Savile was that age was literally no limit for that man. He liked children and he liked young women and young men, and right up to elderly. And he was utterly foul. And one must wonder, what was it that attracted the royal family to Jimmy Savile? Now, it was David Icke who, I think he was one of the original people who talked about Jimmy Savile being a procurer rather of children for the British establishment. And I tend to believe that that is accurate. Jimmy Savile was simply too well connected and too well protected not to have been so. And Arbiter, just going back to Jimmy Savile and his behaviour that was raising suspicion around Charles's offices, Arbiter said that no concerns were raised formally. There's no suggestion that Savile committed any crimes while on royal premises or when he was with Prince Charles. And when Prince Charles' office, a spokesperson Prince Charles, was later asked about Savile and whether they had any understanding about the allegations of paedophilia, they responded, "We have no record of anyone making a complaint." And that in part is the problem, is that Savile was so ingratiated with the royal family that nobody dared make a complaint against him. He weaponized the royal family, as well as how much money he was making for various charities. He weaponized that, and he had that as kind of like a halo, a virtue signaling halo. Look, I'm associated with the royal family. Well, we all know they walk on water, and I make all this money for charity, and we all know that means I'm a good person. And he weaponized both those things in order to be able to carry out being a high profile predator in plain sight. And he was protected. 100% he was protected. And to such a degree that the BBC even knew, I mean, everybody knew that the BBC's corporate charity, Children in Need, said they had been so uncomfortable about Savile that they did not allow him to have any association with the cause. That was the BBC charity for children, for goodness sake. And it's Sir Roger Jones, who was a former chairman of the BBC's Children in Need. He said, when I was with Children in Need, we took the decision that we didn't want him anywhere near to the charity. How extraordinary. Why would you say that? Why would you say somebody who has pulled in approximately £40 million for charity, you don't want him near your children's charity, and yet somehow you did sod all about it? Isn't it extraordinary? I think so too. I think so too. Prince Charles met Savile on numerous occasions. They were close. The relationship between them has been downplayed, vastly so. And that again is why I felt it was quite important. Not quite important, actually, I considered it important to do this because I want to ram home the characters who have been around Charles and who have influenced him. Here's an image of Charles meeting Savile. This was, I believe, the Glencoe trip in 1999 when Charles accepted an invitation to a private meal at Savile's Glencoe house. Savile had asked 3 local women to dress up in pinafores emblazoned with the letters HRH, and Charles subsequently sent Savile a Christmas card with the note, "Jimmy, with affectionate greetings from Charles, give my love to your ladies in Scotland." Charles also sent Savile birthday presents, including boxes of fine cigars, a pair of gold cufflinks on his 80th birthday, with a note that read, "Nobody will ever know what you have done for this country, Jimmy. This is to go some way in thanking you for that." Well, Charles, actually, it turns out that everybody eventually found out what Jimmy Savile had done for this country. And the question is, what did you know? What did you know? Somebody who Charles had trusted implicitly had become personal counsel to Prince Charles in the late 1980s, and at a time when the royal family was in deep trouble. There was the marriage of Charles and Diana on the rocks, and Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson was disintegrating. And it was around New Year 1990 that Charles asked Savile to help the Duchess of York. It was described as keeping her profile down. Princess Diana also talked about Savile, and she was recorded in a conversation with one of her lovers, James Gilby, in the so-called Squidgygate tape. And she said, "Jimmy Savile rang me up yesterday and he said, 'I'm just ringing you up, my girl, to tell you that his nibs, Prince Charles, has asked me to come and help out the redhead, the Duchess of York. And I'm just letting you know so that you don't find out through her or him. And I hope it's all right by you.'" Jimmy Savile was in so deep, it is impossible they didn't know about some of the rumours. And yet they still trusted him with their personal affairs. How extraordinary is that? So Jimmy Savile, along with Lord Louis Mountbatten, are 2 integral, not to be downplayed influences on the life of King Charles. And then from entertainment to religion, there are few areas in public life that are untouched by predators. And here again, Charles has form with his choice of close confidence. So let's look at religion and convicted sex offender Peter Ball, the former bishop of Lewes and Gloucester, who was convicted in 2015 of sexually abusing 18 teens and young men. Ball received a 3-year sentence in October 2015, having admitted to a series of indecent assaults and the abuse of 18 young men aged 17 to 25. One of his victims took his own life. Investigations against Ball were first launched in 1992 when a monk training under him in Gloucester accused Ball of several lewd acts, including watching him shower, embracing him naked, and threatening to beat him. And the first whistleblower said that the indecent behaviour started when he was just 17. Now, what was interesting here was investigators felt that they had enough evidence to bring the case to trial. But, and I would suggest it was because of his royal connections, it was ultimately decided that Ball would instead get a police caution for gross indecency. Instead, meaning that he admitted to the charge and it would lie on his criminal record. And the report into Ball's case found that one of the detectives working on the case was worried about the case going to trial due to, said, Ball's mental state. Who cares? If you're accused of being a prolific predator and paedophile, who cares about your mental state? Of course, your mental state is collapsed if you're behaving like that. And the cop also worried about the devastating effect it would have on the Church of England. Again, who cares? This is how cover-ups have gone on, because people within the British establishment, and police are very much part of that, have covered up these events in order to maintain the status quo of the British establishment. But it was said that there was an understanding that Ball would resign from his post, which he did. This was after the caution. But just 4 months later, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, wrote to Ball about planning his cautious return to ministry. So this is where it gets interesting. So less than 2 years later, after he's had a caution, and a caution to which he would have to admit guilt, he was back to work with no restrictions and was even allowed to be around children and young people unsupervised. Now, here's the thing, is the scandal involving Prince Charles is about Charles's relationship between the first police investigation and the caution, when Charles would know he's been cautioned, and Ball being restated in the church. And people and entities who have become known as breeding grounds for abuse, or kind of like in the case of Margaret Thatcher, a cabinet with predators, and also like Charles, these people gravitate to work with children or in environments where there is this air of respectability. And the church has, we now know, historically been a breeding ground for predators. And Bishop Ball was a royal favourite. He often preached at Sandringham, one of the royal family's private states. And it was in August 1994, following Ball receiving a police caution, which, as I say, is also accompanied by an admission of guilt, Prince Charles sought to get involved. He sent his private secretary to Lambeth Palace to inquire about Ball's status. And he sent his private secretary to the Archbishop's top aide. This is interference. When he learned that Ball had still not been cleared to return to ministry in February 1995, he wrote to Ball saying, I wish I could do more. Bear in mind, Ball has already been cautioned. Okay, he's already been cautioned. He's already admitted his guilt to being a predator. Okay, and Charles writes to him and say, I wish I could do more. I feel so desperately strongly about the monstrous wrongs that have been done to you and the way you have been treated. It's appalling that the Archbishop has gone back on what he told me before Xmas, that he was hoping to restore you to some kind of ministry in the church. I suspect you are absolutely right. It is due to fear of the media, Charles wrote in one of the many letters exchanged during their 2-decade-long correspondence. Charles, like Lord Mountbatten, like Jimmy Savile, Charles was around Bishop Ball, Predator Bishop Ball, for at least 2 decades, receiving guidance from him, including spiritual guidance. Dear God, dear God, awful stuff. And a lot of this was examined at ICSA, which was the independent child abuse inquiry, which was formed following the Jimmy Savile revelations. And Prince Charles, as he was then, had declined to submit an official witness statement. He was asked to submit. So here's the thing. At the child abuse inquiry, people showed up. They gave testimony, not Prince Charles. He was then asked to give a witness statement, which will be verified by a statement of truth. And this essentially means that if you've lied in that witness statement and you've verified it by a statement of truth, you can be prosecuted, even though we know, there's no way Charles is ever going to be prosecuted, right? But in the end, he refused to do a signed witness statement verified by a statement of truth, which should tell people already that there was something really dodgy and troublesome. Okay, and in the end, he just submitted a signed letter instead. And Richard Scorer, who was the lawyer who was representing a lot of the victims, said this will inevitably raise concerns that the letter may be less than entirely frank about his relationship with Peter Ball, and that it contains matters to which he is reluctant to attach a formal statement of truth. And I think it was interesting because it was revealed at the inquiry that the Prince's team had been locked in lengthy and extensive correspondence over the format of the document, which eventually came as a letter. And so the whole point was that by this point, it was absolutely evident to everybody that Prince Charles had been great mates with another predator, and another predator who was going to be examined at the child abuse inquiry, another predator who had living victims. And yet Prince Charles was absolutely reluctant to really say very much at all, and ended up just doing a letter. And what was really annoying, like it is oftentimes with these inquiries, we know that a lot of the time these inquiries are set up as a consequence of public outrage, and public outrage hit really hard around then. It's why I did my film Paedophiles in Parliament, and public outrage was immense following Savile, because it became absolutely apparent that all areas of the British establishment were implicated in the cover-up. But the child abuse inquiry, it was formed really to say to people, we're doing something, but not necessarily to actually do anything. Not really. I mean, we've seen that recently, that all the recommendations were not even, put in. They were not even implemented by the Tory government, and Labour now say that they're going to. But all of it was just a screen to say, look, we care about child abuse and we're going to do something about it, which of course they didn't. And the child abuse inquiry had no power to demand a witness statement under law. So what was the point of it then? To make people think that something was being done. And the Prince's lawyers had argued that the inquiry had no power. They knew. They absolutely knew. Let me just bring up some more imagery of Charles and Bishop Ball, if I can find some here. I mean, this is some. I think this is extraordinary, some of the comments that he made. Oh, no, bear with me. And oh, there's another headline that will do for us, I think. Oh, it's telling me I can't share anymore. Fine. So the prince's lawyers knew that the inquiry had no power, and so that it was eventually agreed that the letter would be accepted, since it covered, in quotes, all of the topics that the inquiry wished to see addressed, as if. And the fact is, Prince Charles was extremely close to Bishop Peter Ball, and that has never really been questioned. Just like Charles's relationship with Jimmy Savile and Lord Louis Mountbatten. Isn't it extraordinary? We've reached a stage where this man has become king, and he has been surrounded by predators all his life. And we have had a number of child abuse inquiries in the multi-millions all around the UK. And the most Prince Charles has had to do is submit a letter. He wouldn't even submit a witness statement. This tells you something. It certainly tells me something. He didn't want to commit to anything, did he? Absolutely he didn't. So submitted that letter to inquiry. He said that he'd been deceived for a long time about the true nature of Ball, and denied trying to influence the outcome of the investigation. And when the ICSA panel published their report, they said the actions of the Prince of Wales were misguided. Misguided. Do you remember when Andrew, to Emily Maitlis in the infamous Newsnight interview, described Jeffrey Epstein's behaviour as untoward? Misguided and untoward. Talk about downplaying systemic child abuse. And the inquiry went on to say his actions the report went on to say that his actions and those of his staff could have been interpreted as expressions of support for Peter Ball, and given the Prince of Wales' future role within the Church of England, had the potential to influence the actions of the church. And the thing is, Charles claimed that he took no position on Peter Ball's return to the church. He said simply that he and his private secretary inquired about Peter Ball within Lambeth Palace. And of course, he should have recognised the potential effect that his apparent support for Peter Ball could have. If you are the future king and you send one of your lackeys to Lambeth Palace, right, the home of the Church of England, to inquire about a bishop who has been removed from the church because he has admitted to his guilt for being a predator, and if you send one of your lackeys to inquire when he will be returning, that has an influence. That's ridiculous to suggest that it doesn't. And the inquiry investigated the extent to which the Church of England had failed to protect children from sexual abuse, and it was massive, of course, we know that. Charles and Bishop Ball had become close because, and Prince Charles had described Peter Ball as a loyal friend. The men were in correspondence, they met. Bishop Ball was Bishop of Gloucester in the 1990s, Highgrove Estate, Charles's house was just down the road, really, private residence, and it's within the diocese. And there was a previous review that had been carried out. Let me just have some water, because I still find it astonishing, even all these years later, that everybody, well, not everybody, but our media, the royal family, all of the establishment handlers, they downplay these relationships. The whole reason of me doing today is not downplay, it's just to bring it slap bang into everybody's face and just go, here's what I think. And as I say, I know some of this has been covered, but not necessarily all of it in the way that I'm doing today. But and also, I don't necessarily claim for it to be the definitive version of Charles and all the predators around him, because it's impossible to be. There are always things that researchers and journalists miss, and that's why I do these things. And I love it when you then come back to me and you contact me and say, did you know blah blah blah, and it enables me to carry on looking into that and take me into different areas of research. So do feel free to do that as well. There had been, prior to the child abuse inquiry, there had been a previous independent review into Bishop Ball. Pretty sure, let me just here he is. Let's just so you can see him in older years. I always feel it's a bit wrong not to show these predators. I want to show these predators. I don't want to protect them in the way that they have been continually protected by the British establishment. Here is Bishop Ball in more recent years before his death. And an independent review into Ball was carried out by Dame Moira Gibb, and it dismissed allegations that any members of the royal family intervened on Ball's behalf. It said Ball himself, both in his correspondence and in his public statements, sought to exploit his contact with members of the royal family in order to bolster his position, and particularly in the eyes of Lord Carey and others from whom he hoped to receive sympathetic treatment. Lord Carey was at the time the head of COE. And the report went on to say, we have reviewed all the relevant material, including the correspondence passing between the Prince of Wales and Ball, held by the church, and found no evidence that the Prince of Wales or any other member of the royal family sought to intervene at any point in order to protect or promote Ball. I should point out that is Dame Moira Gibb, who prepared that report. She's a dame. But the reality is, Ball had continued to abuse young boys and men sexually and physically for his own gratification under the pretense of providing spiritual enlightenment for the duration of his ministry as monk, priest, and later bishop. The report then went on to catalogue. He'd been involved in founding and running religious communities since 1960, when concerns were first raised about him, 1960. This is the thing, is that when these concerns are later then, brought out into sunlight decades later, we can see there's been a trajectory. Concerns have always been raised about these people, whether it's Jimmy Savile, Louis Mountbatten, or Peter Ball. And what was also interesting at the child abuse inquiry was Charles' statement was actually leaked. And the core participants at the inquiry were given an absolute rollicking by the chair, Professor Alexis Jay, because it was leaked to the press and they were the only ones who would have had it prior to the hearing. And Professor Alexis Jay, she expressed her disappointment. She said it was a serious breach of confidence, and the draft statement, as I say, from the Prince had been leaked to the press. And it had been previously disclosed to the core participants, and so they all assumed it must be one of the core participants. And core participants at the child abuse inquiry were people who had an interest in what was under discussion. And Charles admits that he was aware around the time of the police caution that Ball had been involved in an indiscretion, he described it as, and was told by Ball himself that an individual with a grudge had been persecuting Peter Ball. And the Prince's statement said, I was certainly not aware at the time of the significance or impact of the caution. Whilst I note that Peter Ball mentioned the word in a letter to me in October 2009, I was not aware until recently that a caution in fact carries an acceptance of guilt. Are you absolutely kidding me? Are you kidding me that the then Prince of Wales, a senior member of the royal household, had not been informed that the man he was attempting to get back into the church had been given a caution which carried with it an admission of guilt? I don't accept that naivety from Charles. Charge, interesting, that one. And going back to Richard Scorer again, which is the lawyer representing 6 survivors of Peter Ball, in his opening remarks at the child abuse inquiry, he criticised Prince Charles for not making efforts to check the position of Ball in 1993 after the bishop had accepted that caution. And Scorer said this extraordinary lack of curiosity looks like willful blindness. He failed in that responsibility and therefore failed the victims. And he did on both counts. And I don't believe that he didn't know it carried with it an admission of guilt. I simply don't believe it. So there you go. I am calling the Prince of the UK and the Commonwealth a liar. How about that then? And Charles was, as I've said, he was slammed by the Child Abuse Inquiry for his misguided support of Bishop Bull. And Clarence House, Charles' official office, said it remains a matter of deep regret to the Prince that he, along with many others, was deceived by Peter Ball for so many years. At no time did he bring any influence to bear on the actions of the church or any relevant authority. And that's a nonsense. If you've sent your lackey off to have a word about what's happening, you're already bringing your influence to bear. It's simple as that. It's one of those things where you don't need to say, I'm bringing my influence to bear. But when they say, here's a message from Prince Charles, are you going to be reinstating Peter Ball? That is interference. The fact that it is downplayed to being misguided, that there was no interference, that a dame on an independent so-called report said, no, there was no interference. I just think it's ridiculous. And one of Ball's victims said Prince Charles must have been fully aware of the power and influence his support would bring. Of course. And the Child Abuse Inquiry said Prince Charles' actions did have the potential to influence actions of the Church of England. Of course. Peter Ball was disgusting. I'm not going to go into any details about what any of these people did really, but other than to say, just to give you a brief idea, that Peter Ball did things like he ordered victims to strip and pray, suggested they submit to beatings, claimed it was all for religious reasons, abused them. Again, it was in the name of God and Jesus. Absolutely disgusting, abhorrent things. These people have given Christianity, Catholicism, and any other religion you care to mention a dreadful name, a dreadful name and a dreadful reputation. And religion has long harboured predators. We know that. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, who crowned Charles at his coronation. Here he is. You can see him crowning Charles. He was forced to resign following the John Smythe abuse revelations. And, John Smythe had systematically abused many boys, and when the Church of England realized what was going on, they packed him off to a foreign country, Africa, where it is believed that he may have killed at least one child. And John Smythe even abused his own children. He would he beat children so badly that they had to wear nappies. He beat them to blood. He said, again, it was for God, it was for Jesus. These people are absolutely sick. And Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, as I say, was finally forced to resign because the Making report came out as a damning report into prolific child abuser John Smythe. And Justin Welby had been quite arrogant, saying, I won't be resigning. And then 1 week later, he issued a resignation statement saying that he must take personal and institutional responsibility for the long and re-traumatizing period between 2013 and 2024, because the reality is that Justin Welby, who Charles also considered a great friend, Justin Welby, then Archbishop of Canterbury, had been informed in 2013 about John Smythe and that the police had been notified. And Justin Welby went on to say, I believed wrongly that an appropriate resolution would follow. Yeah, but what about checking up? And that's the thing, isn't it? Is these people never did. They were ever so sorry when the stuff hit the fan afterwards. But what about all the years in between? Justin Welby systematically failed all of the victims of John Smythe, as well as victims of the Church of England. And the report into what had gone on with John Smythe found that the police referral had not been made, but that it was reasonable to conclude that Welby had received the assurance. It also found that Welby should have made further attempts to pursue the matter, but that none of them want to, right? None of them want to pursue the matter when it came to abusing children. And in the end, Justin Welby arrogantly tried to cling on. He said, I am not going to resign. He said that he would not resign, that he gave it a lot of thought. And then, as I say, a week later, he was forced to resign. Such arrogance. And this was a man who was dear to Charles. Charles confided in Justin Welby a great deal, both for his spiritual guidance and intellectual guidance. They shared a great deal in common, both of them hideously kind of like part of the whole Build Back Better, WEF, World Economic Forum world, and they came together through that. But Welby was also the man who carried out all of the rituals at the coronation. And so it's like it comes to a point where Charles can barely move for the sheer volume of predators and their enablers around him. And don't forget, he is these days considered the supreme defender of, he now calls himself supreme defender of all faiths, but it was originally, he's the head of the Church of England. But Charles is very much somebody who considers himself a man of the world, shall we say. And also, let us not forget that Charles' own brother Andrew famously has been accused of being a predator and has ties to international abusers. So let's see what we can. I'm sure I've got an image of Charles and Andrew together. Let me see what I can find. I can never tell. Let's see what I've got. Oh, there we go. Here's the pair of them again in regalia that they didn't earn, but that's what you get with people like this. Royal family are the original fake it till you make it, right? Or fake it and you will make it. Here's Andrew and Charles. And obviously, Andrew has become very much known as the royal predator these days. Excuse me. Wipe my nose again. Andrew has become very much known as a royal predator these days, but I would argue, given what we know about Andrew and what we've been told about Andrew, he's the least of the problems in the royal household, but who knows? And obviously, Andrew was accused of having sex with Virginia Giuffre, who was accused of being trafficked, who was said to have been trafficked to him by Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. Now, in the UK, it would have been legal for Andrew to have sex, albeit horrible, and just horrible, immoral and repugnant, because Virginia was 17 when she was said to have had sex with Andrew in the UK, but she was under the age of consent when she was said to have been trafficked to him in the US, in which case it would have been rape. And Ghislaine Maxwell obviously long had ties to the royal family, and Maxwell and Epstein became such trusted people. They were even allowed to stay in the Royal Lodge at, I think it was Balmoral. Some imagery here. And you have to be somebody who's part of the inner circle who gets to do that. Simple stuff. Here's some images, all from the same place. So what you have is the image of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein at the lodge. And there's the Queen with her lunch on her lap at the lodge. And then there's Prince Philip with Zara Phillips, Princess Anne's daughter, and Prince Philip's granddaughter. All of them enjoyed the lodge hideaway at Balmoral, including Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell had long ties to the royal family, and they were trusted people. And this undated image, by the way, of Epstein and Maxwell, it first surfaced in court filings. It's thought to have been taken in around 1999. And Andrew had reportedly invited the couple to stay on the Scottish estate. Andrew eventually was, or rather his mum, Queen Elizabeth, was reported to have paid in the region of $12 million for Virginia Giuffre to go away. Sadly, Virginia was said to have taken her own life in April this year at her Australian farm. Rumours that she was the victim of domestic violence for years, as well as being estranged from her children, was said to have pushed her over the edge. But who really knows? I know a lot of people dispute that, and I think it's a fair point given the nature of the people that we're discussing. I'm not talking about Virginia here. Given the nature of the people that we're discussing, and the need to keep a lid on royal predatory behaviour, who ultimately knows? But also, can anybody remember when Andrew invited who are now 3 convicted sex and trafficking offenders to his daughter's birthday party? Let me show you an image of this if you're not familiar. Extraordinary stuff. Let me just find it. Take me a little while, but please excuse me. But I do think it's quite important to be able to show, because, well, apart from anything else, this will. Oops, I've got all these images of Lord Louis Mountbatten at the moment, and I'm not quite sure why. Right. Oh, they went. Here we go. Oh no. So what happened was, it was one of Andrew's daughter's birthdays. This was, of course, not the birthday where he was said to have been unable to sweat. This was another birthday altogether. And come to me, dear picture. I know I've got you somewhere, and I want to show people. Because it says so much, doesn't it, about what has been taking place. And again, I wanted to cover this because I think the aim has long been to minimise the role of the royal family when it comes to predatory behaviour. And I don't think that's advisable at all. What have I done with it? I'm annoyed there, because I definitely had an image that I'm not now finding, but it was an image of Epstein, Maxwell, and Harvey Weinstein, and they were all together at the in the Windsor Castle grounds in a birthday party. The Queen had a tradition, rather, of birthday parties for her grandchildren. And on this one occasion, the birthday party was organised for Beatrice. It was the party's theme was 1888, and the idea was to mark 100 years before Beatrice was born, and 400 guests were invited to celebrate the occasion. And I don't know why I can't find my picture, but it's annoying, and it does exist, and you will find it on Google. And Andrew had invited Epstein, Maxwell, and Weinstein. Now, at that time, none of them had been convicted, although there were clear rumours around all of them. And again, going back to the fact that I find it impossible to believe that Andrew, one of the Queen's sons, had not been informed by secret services, hey, you do know that this person, there's rumours about this. They would have done that. And the fact that Charles and Andrew continued to have relationships with people who would have been suspect tells us rather a lot. And one of the things that it tells us was that they knew they were above the law. And what was also interesting was, at the time of Beatrice's 18th, police had already prepared an arrest warrant for Epstein on child sex abuse charges. They raided his Florida mansion just 8 days after Epstein had posed in a US Navy SEAL uniform at Beatrice's birthday party. And just 8 days after that, he was in cuffs. Don't anybody tell me Andrew didn't know. This is beginning to look more like a choice than misfortune or naivety. Come on now. Again, all people around the royal family have a duty to protect them from this sort of stuff. It is inconceivable that they were unaware of their acquaintances. They would have been informed. Their inner circle would have been informed. I don't accept they didn't know. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny. As I say, this is beginning to look more like a choice, for goodness sake. Again, all people around the royal family had then and have now a duty to protect them. It is inconceivable that they were unaware of their acquaintances. And as I say, none of it stands up to scrutiny. And, it's troubling, isn't it? I don't accept that members of the royal household did not know that they had predators around them. I don't accept it. And again, another predator who was so in with the royal household, he was even given a private sitting with the Queen in order to paint her, for goodness sake. Let me, I must have this, surely. Hate to think I've not got this. Let's have a look. Yes, let's have a look at those images. And I am talking, of course, if you're unfamiliar, Rolf Harris. Rolf Harris, well, again, highly celebrated children's entertainer of the 70s and 80s, famously painted the Queen. There he is. And that's not something that just anyone gets to do. He was a firm favourite with both Charles and Diana, as indeed Jimmy Savile was. And in 2014, Rolf Harris was jailed for nearly 6 years for 12 indecent assaults against 4 girls, including one aged just 7 or 8. And the judge, Mr. Justice Sweeney, said that Harris, who was 84 at the time, had taken advantage of his celebrity status and had shown no remorse. He was given a sentence of 5 years, 9 months. He had which had already been referred to the Attorney General's office because it was considered unduly lenient sentence. I wonder if that had anything to do with his royal connections. One victim said the abuse from Rolf Harris had taken away her childhood innocence. And Harris, as I say, he was found guilty of offences. Those offences took place between 1968 and 1986. And he was told by the judge that he had no one but himself to blame. And again, somebody who bobbed around the royal household. Now I don't know about you. And obviously the spotlight is far more on the royal family than most other families. But how many other families have the misfortune of so many predators and paedophiles who happen to be deeply entwined with their family? I don't know any other family like the royal family who seem to have that many predators in their midst. That seems extraordinary to me. Extraordinary. And you have to wonder how much of a lighthouse was Lord Louis Mountbatten to these other predators, right? Because he had such a hold, he held sway over the royal family, over Philip, over Elizabeth, over Charles in particular, over the very 3 senior ones. And that he was, the book says he was part of a paedophile ring, which involved British politicians, which involved our British secret services. And, Lord Mountbatten probably, we don't, the thing is, decent people struggle to believe that these things can be possibly true because it's very difficult to put your mind into the mindset of these predators. Why should you want to? I would advise you not to, because that old saying, you stare too long into the abyss, it starts to stare back at you. And as somebody who's investigated this stuff, I try and be as brief and quick in looking at anything new as I possibly can, because I don't like to go into it. I find it too dark. A lot of it is ritualistic. There's certainly an air of Satanism which surrounds the whole thing. We know that as well. Very ritualistic, as in Charles beginning at school. And again, I go back to, I think Louis Mountbatten was this some sort of lighthouse beacon to other predators, that this is an open house. We are accepting of predators in the royal household. I think that's how he stood. And of course, there were other situations where the royals have now since been seen to have been aligned with sexual predators. And some of these situations, you can't necessarily blame the royals involved because they may have been badly advised. But one of them I'm thinking about is, do anybody remember It's a Royal Knockout? Oh, what an... Look, English, British people will remember It's a Royal Knockout. It was just quite extraordinary. It was in June 1987. It pitched 4 teams of celebrities, including John Travolta, Toya Wilcox, Gary Lineker, and Cliff Richard, against each other in a series of bizarre games, which was captained by Prince Edward, Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Sarah Ferguson. It was an absolute disaster. It was compared by BBC presenter Stuart Hall, who went on to be convicted of 14 counts of indecent assaults, each of which refers to one specific incident only. There were 13 victims whose ages at the time ranged from 9 to 17. And again, why weren't the royal household, let me show you some images from this, what a disaster that was. Anybody remember it? Because one of the infamous moments about this when it happened was there was a press conference after the event, and Prince Edward, who again, very over entitled, very privileged, he was like, didn't you have a great time? Wasn't it? Didn't we have fun? Yada, 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 yada. And the press reaction was very lukewarm because it had been disastrous. Here's Stuart Hall with every member of the royal family who were there. And it was an absolute disaster. And Prince Edward ended up walking out in a huff from the press tent. And that's probably one of the single most memorable points of it. But it was a disaster. And I think there's some interesting people in there. Cliff Richard, of course, went on to have his house raided by police in the full gaze of the BBC. I maintain to this day that who else has their house raided under suspicion of them being a paedophile, and the BBC are there? Of course, Cliff Richard was able to take legal action against the BBC. And I don't actually think any of that would have stood up in a court of law anyway. It all seemed like a setup to me, frankly. But the Royal It's a Knockout was probably one of the single worst PR decisions the royal family had made, in terms of, because what they were trying to do was make themselves look very accessible and like one of us. And they also had the nerve to do it on the anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta. But the It's a Royal Knockout, absolute disaster. And yes, as I say, a BBC presenter again, Stuart Hall, went on to plead guilty and be convicted of indecent assaults against children. So none of this is new, but I should point out, and it's important to point out, that Charles and Diana both declined the invitation to take part in this. And at the time, Edward said he remembers feeling miffed that they refused to do it. He said, I thought they were being most unsportsmanlike, like not supporting the family as we should. Perhaps they'd already been given the heads up. Perhaps they'd already been told, not only is that going to be make you look ridiculous and humiliate you, it's not going to make you look any more accessible, but you will also be around somebody who's considered to be a predator. Who knows? And maybe unlike the 3 predators that Charles had kept close to him, maybe he considered Stuart Hall not worthy enough to take a hit for, not to be a hill that he wanted to die on. Who knows? But the reality is, and I think we can all see that, and we all know it, is that there are endless links of child abuse to the royal family for a very, very long time. And yet the royal family are still portrayed as almost like people who walk on water, people we should aspire to be, people we should look up to. And I find that extraordinary, because it's not only do I find the concept of royalty abhorrent anyway. I certainly wasn't born to doff my cap to anybody. And anybody who tells me, because people like to go, oh yeah, but they're so great for tourism. No, they're not. Legoland Windsor has routinely received more tourists than any of the palaces. And the Palace of Versailles in France, which has no royal family, has long been in the top 10 of tourist attractions in the world. So no, the British royal family do very little for us. And then, of course, there is other issues that we've heard around the Queen, around the British royal family, around Prince Charles, including sending children away to, for example, Canada and Australia. This was also under the child abuse spotlight. The Fairbridge Society. The Fairbridge Society was set up in 1909. And its sole function was to emigrate children from Britain to the Empire. It became the most prominent migration-only operator in the child migration programs. It ceased to exist in the early 1980s. It went on all the way up to 1980s. How much more vulnerable are children than a lot of these children were being taken from care homes or from dysfunctional families, and they're sent away thousands of miles from home. How much more vulnerable are they? And hundreds of British children were removed from poor working class families by the UK government, and they were sent to these farm schools in Australia and Canada. And the idea was that they were going to get opportunity in education. And then what happened? I'm sure you're not going to be surprised, but they suffered serious sexual abuse. And the child abuse inquiry in 2018 concluded that Fairbridge had failed to protect children at 4 farm schools in Australia, Canada, and southern Rhodesia from sexual abuse. It called the child migration programs a deeply flawed policy that caused lifelong damage to many children, and recommended that surviving children receive financial redress. So what does that have to do with Prince Charles? Well, the Prince's Trust took over Fairbridge, and in 2012, the Trust formally apologised in 2018 for the hurt and suffering experienced by victims and survivors. And the Prince's Trust, of course, that was the charitable trust that Charles had set up, and the aim was to work with disadvantaged young people. And it took over the Fairbridge, but it treated the survivors of the farm schools absolutely appalling, and Charles knew about it. And here's what they did. And the Prince's Trust, which is arguably one of the best known and wealthiest youth charities in the country, had said that not much money had been put aside for the Fairbridge Restored, which was the fund to compensate survivors of the scheme. And it was understood to be in the region of 1.2 million. And as I say, the Prince's Trust was responsible for the Fairbridge scheme, and it's legally liable for the survivors' claims because it took over Fairbridge. And the High Court had previously said that Fairbridge survivors deserve at least £204,000 each. Guess what the Prince's Trust offered them? Just guess. £2,000. £2,000. The Prince's Trust under Prince Charles said they did not have the money to compensate these victims and offered them £2,000. They hate working class children. They sent them away from home. I grew up in a working class family, very much so. Actually, we aspired to be working class. We were sort of lower class. But there are often problems because poverty brings a lot of problems. These children were not only taken away from their home and sent abroad, they were abused. And when it came to acknowledging their abuse, they were due to be compensated at the very least. At the very least, children who are abused by authorities or under the UK government or royalty or under any of those banners must be compensated. And £2,000 doesn't cut it. So it just, when I looked at that and when I reflected on that, I was like, that's just so interesting, because Charles didn't put any store by abused children. He thought they were worth £2,000, even though the High Court had said their pain and suffering or their claims are worth at least £204,000. So in the end, it was they will receive only 1% of that figure, because of insufficient monies had been set aside for the claims by the Prince's Trust, because they simply didn't care. They simply didn't care. And you know that's the truth. So I think I really just want to reflect on everything that I've said, really. And that is, I want to kind of finish where I started, and that is, it is not an overstatement to say that the sitting king, King Charles III, has been substantially influenced by at least 3 child abusers, at least. And let's just, where are they? Let's just bring them on. Bear with me. This is a funny little system when you try and bring in more pictures. There we go. Let's bring them all up so you can see them all together. And so he has been substantially influenced by at least 3 child abusers. And I mean substantially influenced. He's taken guidance. He's taken spiritual advice. He's taken marriage guidance and marriage advice from predators, from perverts, from paedophiles. Is anybody going to try and convince me that in some way that will not have rubbed off on him? Now, I'm not sitting here suggesting that the King of England is a paedophile. That would be going too far. But he has certainly been influenced by Lord Louis Mountbatten, his surrogate father/grandfather, Bishop Peter Ball, his spiritual advisor, DJ Jimmy Savile, his marriage and relationship advisor. Obviously, these 3 men do not include all the other predators who have circled around the royal family for decades. But these 3 men and the deep relationships Charles had with each one is significant. What did he learn from these men? Is it conceivable that Charles himself could have been a victim of abuse? Is it possible that Charles was groomed by them? I don't rule it out. It would be foolish with my knowledge of child abuse to do so. King Charles' life is anything but regular, and there is a disproportionate amount of child predators who are close to the royal institution. Charles was textbook vulnerable, a young boy sent away from home with emotionally distant and vacant parents. He was ripe to be groomed by any number of predators, and he almost certainly was. Some people won't even be able to deal with what I am saying, even with evidence such as Peter Ball, Bishop Ball. These people still want to believe the royal family is a shining example of everything that is right and good in this world. The royal family, the British royal family, have been portrayed as above and beyond reproach, that they are above the ills and issues of us lesser mortals, if only. But the royal family is a brand. They are human and they are fallible, and they make mistakes and they do bad things, even criminal things, but they know they will get away with it. The crown is a vast industry invested in protecting the institution. Many well-connected people are heavily invested and reliant on the crown surviving. They will protect the crown at all costs. And if that involves covering up child abuse and covering up how much the present king knew, then so be it. Historically, the British royal family have long been degenerates because they've been allowed to get away with it all. But the buck must stop with the present monarch. A greedy net zero zealot who involves himself in business that he has no right involving himself in. He has become known as the Weft King. But is he also another kind of king? The reality is King Charles III has long enjoyed the company of predators, paedophiles, and child abuse enablers. He seems to gravitate towards them. Why? The question is, was this deliberate, or has he been fooled like the rest of us? I know which one I think it was. Charles is far from an idiot. He repeatedly told us that. He's always been one of the more intelligent members of the royal family, famous for doing huge amounts of research into our world and firing off missives to politicians. Yet we are to believe that he had no clue of what was going on with 3 main males in his own life. I call BS. I say not only was he aware of the people in his midst, but he has been enabled by a multitude of people, from royal court advisors and prime ministers to members of the press who act like public relations for the firm, to downplay these connections and his knowledge of them. It is a scandalous state of affairs that prominent world media, that of legacy media largely continues to portray the British royal family as a family that walks on water and that we should all look up to. The most recent incarnation, of course, they are doing their damnedest, aren't they, to show us that they are like us. William, Kate, Charles, Camilla. Let's just find a picture of them. Oh, where are they? Where are they? Charles and Paul. Oh, it's Charles and Camilla. Let's find them. Here they are. Now, we have been, because Kate's supposed to be like a commoner, but actually that's not even true, because she has historic ties to the royal family as well. And they sold us this idea that her mother was an air hostess and they just had a party planning business, but Kate was just somebody who happened to go to the same college as William, yada yada yada. These people are not like us, they'll never be like us, and because not one of them will ever have to worry about paying their bills or keeping a roof over their head. That much we do know. And let me just remove that. There we go. There they are again, all done up in all their regalia, and they make you sick. So the whole idea about this recent incarnation is that they have been designed to kid the British people that they're good value for money and that they're one of us. And as I say, they'll never be one of us. They are the royal family and they should long have been abolished. But the fact remains, the head of it, King Charles III, has been influenced by some of the lowest life scum to be produced in the last century. It is a damning indictment that the King of England, the King of the Commonwealth, is a man who has had an unfeasibly high volume of predators in his inner circle, including great friends, guides and family, and has appeared to enjoy each and every one of them until they were busted. And we are expected to believe that he had no clue about any one of them. Really? I don't think so. You know, I think that there comes a point when you have to say, surely there are just too many coincidences for us to keep chalking it down to coincidence that Charles seemed to attract these type of people. I know what I think. And I just felt the need to discuss that today because, frankly, it disgusts me. It disgusts me that we are still fed this lie that they are something for us to look up to aspire, that these are people with wonderful morals. No, they aren't. Far from it. If they were, they'd be doing a great deal more for people, wouldn't they? But they don't want to. They are part of an institution. And that institution also means that they cannot own up to being possibly, potentially part of a long existing predatory and paedophile ring. These are realities. Let me see what you have to say in the comments. Sam says, these people are above the law and they should not be. They have subjugated our English constitution. And I don't know what's going on. Who's saying Epstein was Jewish, not Muslim? I have no idea what's that about. Dell says Camilla is an enabler. Camilla, of course, has been with Charles throughout his, life. The affair, frankly, continued when he was still with Diana, albeit via telephone, but it was still an affair. And Mountbatten knew about it. Mountbatten didn't want him to marry Camilla because he realized that Camilla was more worldly, more experienced than, for example, who Charles went on to choose. And Charles chose Diana based on the advice of Mountbatten, saying what you need is, essentially somebody who can, sire royal children for you, but is untouched and is a bit green and naive and is a nice girl. And they thought all that about Diana. Oh, little did they know. Oh, little did they find out what was going to happen with Diana. She almost destroyed them all, which was rather nice. Trinity said, we're not in the club. Thank you, Christine. I appreciate that very much. It's a big club and you're not in it, Cookie Monster. We are suffering their karma because they want to feel better. All the kids are sodomized. I can see that all of you are as enraged as I am. And that's why, you know, the thing is, when I do these, is not necessary. A lot of my regular viewers will be absolutely aware of the things that I've talked about, but I like to put them together in a format that is easily accessible for people who aren't necessarily aware. I often get emails from people who say, oh, my whoever didn't believe that Margaret Thatcher had paedophiles around them, but I sent them your film Paedophiles in Parliament because it was so easy and accessible to understand, and now they get it. And that's why I do it, because I like to believe that the work I do is accessible. It's not convoluted, it's very straightforward. I try and get to the point as much as I humanly can. And I just like to present it like, you know, here it is. This is now a video. And I don't think anybody can ever say ever again that Prince Charles has not been surrounded his entire life by predators. I mean, because it would be a lie. It's just wrong. So thank you for being here today, as ever. Thank you for the super chat, as ever. Thank you. You're very welcome, Claire. I appreciate having you. And Stephen, Hugh Edwards was a royal correspondent, explains him walking free from court. Well, that, and also because our courts notoriously do not imprison men and women who download child abuse. But Hugh Edwards, who was obviously a BBC reporter, and he eventually convicted of creating and downloading child abuse images, he was considered an asset. Absolutely, he was. He was the one who announced the death of the Queen, and he was the one who did the voiceover for the BBC for the royal coronation. They're all in it together. As somebody said, it's a big club and we're not in it. Thank you so much. Wonderful to have you with us. And yes, all those, I have to agree. And I chose not to go into the whole kind of adrenochrome thing. But I think that when I talk about Satanism, perhaps I will do a part 2 about Satanism around the royal family, because it's very much part of the same thing. And before I go, actually, I want to talk just briefly about lovely Dr. Joan Coleman. Dr. Joan Coleman was responsible for the Rains List. The Rains List was, and I've talked about this before, and it's in my film Paedophiles in Parliament, so please do go check that. It's available on YouTube. And I interviewed Joan shortly before her death. Joan was, I believe, a psychiatrist. And it was her job in the 80s and 90s to talk to children who were being sent to her, claiming that they were being abused by members of the establishment and subject to Satanist rituals. And Joan met her partner, who she was with before her death, via his sister, who had come to Joan and claimed to have been abused by former Prime Minister Edward Heath. And Joan was very clear that Satanism was an issue that surrounded both the royal household and Parliament. And so maybe that is something for, you know, a further addition to this, really. But I just wanted to focus more on the influences around Charles rather than what they've actually all done. Because a lot of that will be, you know, possibly guesswork. Although I trusted Joan. Joan had come up with the Rains List, and she said that she'd come up with it, and it was a list of very famous men and women across all areas of British life, including politics, including royalty, including media, including publishing and finances, banking, etc. And Joan had supplied this list of the Rains List of all these names, and these were from children who had independently given her the names of these people. And she said to me that she only added these names to the list, that they had been involved in child abuse and Satanism, when they had been independently verified by several of her child clients. Very interesting stuff, and please check that out. So I say more about this in my film Paedophiles in Parliament, by the way. So thank you for being here. I very much appreciate it. Sylvia, I will respond to that. Sylvia's daughter said, "Our child hunting part is true." Yes, Sylvia, I believe they are. I believe they are, because Joan Coleman told me an extraordinary story which involved the sister of her partner. And the sister of her partner had been very young. This is all in my film Paedophiles in Parliament. As I say, do check it out. And Joan talked about how these children were taken to country manors, and then they were released into the garden, and then the hounds were sent out to go and capture them. Now, adrenochrome, of course, we know, and they even talk about it in Hollywood now because they know it's a thing. Adrenochrome is blood that is said to come from young people, and it rejuvenates people. But there is also something else involved with it, and that is the terror that the children experience at the point of death, of which the blood is then taken from. It's horrible stuff. There's a lot of information online, and a lot of Hollywood celebrities now talk about how they use blood over their face to rejuvenate their looks and everything. All this stuff is in plain sight. But yes, child hunting, I believe, is possible. Absolutely. And there you go. And Hugh, if your good idea is that I do another hour, I wish you lots of good luck with that. I've got to go. We are all awakening to their dark depravities, Tony. Yes, we are indeed. It's created by terror. It is indeed. And yes, who says that? Sue, someone I met years ago told me of child hunting parties in the New Forest and other parts of Dorset. I'm pretty sure that's the area that Joan Coleman was talking about. It's famous for it. Became famous for it. So I want to thank you all for being here today. You're absolute stars. Lovely to have you with us. Expialidocious, part 2 soon, please. Love conquers all, says Vanessa. I'm so glad these horrors have now become public knowledge, says Kath. And I think what I seek to do is normalize the telling of this. Because for so long, and don't forget, I worked in mainstream media for decades. They wouldn't let us cover anything like this, and I was a contributing and consulting editor at ITM, which supplies news for the 3 main channels in the UK, and for 8 years. And they had originally brought me in because of my work, where I was looking into allegations of paedophilia within the British Parliament. But when I wanted to start for us to drill down closer to home, to the royal family, they were like, no, the British public are not ready for this. And that's what they say in legacy media. And so legacy media will have it, as I say, that the royal family is a family we should look up to. And they want us to believe in this new incarnation that they are just like us. But I'm here to tell you that they are not. They're not like us, not at all. And the sooner we abolish them, frankly, the better, but not before they are all fully exposed. And on that note, I would like to play the credits of our show. Thank you to everybody who has contributed to the making of every Wake Up, which includes people on the Super Chat, anybody who has contributed to buy me a coffee, excuse me, or is a patron. I appreciate you dearly. I truly do. Thank you so much, Mr. Mack. I appreciate all of you very, very much. Thank you. Merv says 502 likes. Is that a record for Wake Up? See if we can get it higher. Probably during the show. We're over 2,000 live views as well, which is great. And thank you. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Awakening with Reiki. Sterling show, superb effort. Yes, please, to part 2. Love you lots. I will, of course, see you on Monday before I go. Here's the credits. Thank you so much for being here. Oops, no, I'm going to remove that because it's not working. It's not working properly. Perhaps what I need to do is remove that. It's time to wake up with Sonia Poulton. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate you greatly. Monday's show is, of course, our news show. I will see you then, 9 a.m. British summertime. Have a superb weekend. Take excellent, excellent care of yourself. Take excellent, excellent care of yourself. Lots of love to you. See you Monday, peeps.